There are rare moments in history when an ordinary person becomes extraordinary, not by choice, but by necessity. This is the story of a man who didn't start out trying to bring down a system. He started out like any one of us, just trying to live his life. Yet, something happened, a discovery, that changed everything for him. And once he began digging, there was no turning back. It all began with a question. A simple, nagging thought that wouldn't let him rest. He had been working on a small project, nothing too out of the ordinary, just routine paperwork, when something caught his eye. It was a single document, one that had passed through his hands countless times before. But this time, something felt different about it. Something wasn't right. A tiny error, something insignificant to most people, yet it nagged at him. Something in the fine print seemed off. So he took a closer look. And what he uncovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. This wasn't a minor oversight. It was a crack in the foundation, a flaw that pointed to something much larger. What began as an innocent mistake revealed a trail that led to the highest levels of the judicial system, layers of corruption, deceit, and misused power. Powerful figures, some in positions of trust, others with connections that ran deep, all involved in a web of manipulation and secrecy. It was as if the very system meant to protect people had become the tool of those seeking to control and destroy them. He had stumbled upon evidence that could bring down a house of cards decades in the making. But as anyone who has ever uncovered the truth can tell you, the deeper you go, the more dangerous it becomes. He realized quickly that his findings weren't just inconvenient, they were a direct threat to people in high places. People who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. And so began the quiet warnings. It started subtly. He'd find that his calls were disconnected mid-conversation, or his emails never made it to their intended recipients. His office had been left open once, his files strangely out of place. He thought little of it at first. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe not. But soon, he couldn't ignore the pattern. A colleague he trusted one day whispered to him, "You're digging too deep. You need to stop." Yet, even with this warning, he refused to back down. The evidence he had, the lives it could change, the people it could save, made him believe that it was all worth the risk. But as the pressure mounted, so did the stakes. His friends began noticing things. Cars parked outside his house at odd hours, always the same make, always silent, never moving. Strangers would stare at him too long, their eyes filled with something unreadable. They knew who he was, and he knew they were watching him. Still, the man pressed on. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about justice. He gathered his research, began compiling the documents, and made preparations to go public. He felt he had to share this information, to expose the truth to the world. After all, if no one else was willing to do it, then it was his duty. He believed it was the only way to make sure the system would never be the same again. The hours grew long. He spent sleepless nights going over his work again and again. He began reaching out to journalists, planning to expose everything to the public. The more he planned, the more he realized the gravity of what he was about to unleash. But it didn't matter to him. The truth needed to be heard. He couldn't stop now. The files were almost ready. He'd gone over every detail, checked every name, confirmed every source. This was bigger than him. Bigger than anyone who could be affected. And he knew that by revealing it, he would change the course of history. He had the power to alter everything. But then something strange happened. He started receiving phone calls in the middle of the night, no one on the other end, just a strange buzzing noise. The kind of noise you can't easily explain away. It sent a shiver down his spine. And when he went to meet a trusted confidant, they told him, "I don't think you're safe. You need to be careful." He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't believe it. These weren't just empty threats, they were a warning. But he pushed forward, convinced he was on the right side of this fight. The closer he came to revealing his findings, the more anxious he became. And then, just as he was ready, it happened. The one thing he had feared most. His life was taken. But it wasn't a simple tragedy. It wasn't just an accident. His death raised more questions than answers. It was as if he had simply disappeared. No one could explain it. The details didn't add up. Was it natural? Was it murder? Was it a cover-up? The authorities, who had barely shown interest in his work before, were quick to call it a tragic accident. But those who knew him, those who knew the truth, believed otherwise. Who was this man? What did he uncover? Why did they want to silence him so desperately? And who was involved in making sure that the truth would never see the light of day? His name, once a whisper in the halls of justice, is now a symbol of something much larger, the price of uncovering the truth. And so, the questions remain. The system, the people he exposed, they continue to operate, but his legacy is alive. His story is a chilling reminder that sometimes, the price of truth is too high. What happened to him? And who is responsible for what happened next? The story you're about to hear will leave you wondering if justice was ever truly served. This is the story of a man who died for the truth. But was the truth really all we think it was? Stay with us until the end. The answers, the details, the shocking revelations, they'll all come to light soon enough. In a world where justice is meant to be blind, we are often reminded that those who hold power can sometimes tip the scales to their advantage. The judicial system, an institution built to protect the innocent, uphold laws, and ensure fairness, was never meant to be a tool for personal gain. Yet, across history, there are countless stories of corruption where those who wear the robes of authority forget their duty to the people they serve. They become entangled in their own web of deceit, protected by power, by wealth, by influence. The judicial system, when corrupted, becomes more than just a system of courts and laws, it becomes a fortress of secrecy. And in the shadow of this fortress stand the whistleblowers, the brave souls who risk everything to expose the truth. To them, the cost is unimaginable. The lives they've built, the families they cherish, the very safety they take for granted, all stand on the line. And often, the consequences of their courage are deadly. When you challenge such a powerful system, you don't just face opposition from a few individuals, you face the full weight of a broken machine. A machine that will stop at nothing to protect itself. And those who dare to speak out against it? They often find themselves isolated, silenced, or worse. They are forced to walk a tightrope, balancing their lives on the razor-thin edge of truth and retribution. So, what happens when one man, one ordinary individual, dares to stand against the corrupted forces within the very system meant to protect him? What happens when the laws, designed to serve justice, are manipulated to serve only those with the most power? This story is not just one of betrayal, it is a warning that when you expose the powerful, you may find yourself becoming the target. But this man didn't just stumble into the role of a whistleblower. It was never his intention to take on such a fight. At the start, he was just like anyone else, trying to navigate life in a world that often doesn't care about truth or justice. He never asked for the heavy burden that came with uncovering the deepest secrets of the system. But once the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, once he realized what he had stumbled upon, there was no turning back. His discovery revealed just how far the corruption ran, from judges to politicians, from businessmen to law enforcement. These were not isolated incidents. This was systemic corruption, a long-running abuse of power that had been covered up for years. And now, armed with the evidence, he had a choice: expose the truth and risk everything, or stay silent and allow the powerful to continue their unchecked reign. But what could he do? What does a single man do when the forces he faces are too large, too influential, and too entrenched to fight alone? With no allies to turn to and nowhere to hide, he was forced to make a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Would he sacrifice his safety, his career, and his future in pursuit of the truth? Or would he allow these forces to continue unchecked, knowing that the lives of countless others would be destroyed in the process? In a system built on justice, what happens when the scales are tipped in favor of the powerful? What happens when those who are meant to uphold the law become the very ones who break it? What followed next wasn't just the story of a man unveiling corruption, it was the unraveling of a system that was supposed to serve and protect. A system that instead became the enemy of truth. And this man's discovery would force everyone to face uncomfortable questions about just how deep the rot runs. He was a man of simple means, an ordinary citizen living a quiet life, far from the headlines, far from the corruption that ran beneath the surface of the legal system. But that all changed the day he started looking into a set of foreclosure cases that didn't add up. It started with a few small questions, innocent at first, a curiosity about irregularities in the paperwork, an odd feeling that something wasn't right. The truth is, he never expected to find what he did. He never set out to expose the dark underbelly of the judicial system or to become a part of the story himself. He was just like you or me, someone who saw a problem and thought he could help fix it. But in a system built on secrecy, when you start peeling back the layers, what you find is often more dangerous than you imagined. This was not just about a few bad apples. No, what he uncovered was systemic, an elaborate network of collusion, corruption, and fraudulent practices that reached the highest levels of the judicial system. It was more than just errors on a piece of paper, it was a concerted effort to manipulate the law for personal gain. At first, his focus was narrow. He began looking into the details of various foreclosure cases where homeowners seemed to be losing everything they had, and yet the details seemed off. The documents didn't match up. The signatures were rushed, the dates were inconsistent, and in some cases, properties that had been foreclosed upon were sold to buyers who had a suspicious amount of influence in the court system. With each new case he uncovered, the pattern became clearer. The corruption wasn't just a few isolated incidents, it was the system itself that had failed. But he didn't stop there. What began as a small inquiry into one case quickly grew into an exhaustive investigation into the entire judicial process, one where the lines between law enforcement, real estate brokers, and judges blurred into a toxic mix. He unearthed public records that had been sealed away, documents redacted without explanation, and phone records that revealed clandestine conversations between powerful individuals. And then came the maps. Maps that laid out not just the properties in question, but the people behind them, the ones profiting from the misery of others. Real estate transactions connected to judges, lawyers, even politicians. He began to see the full scope of what he had uncovered, and with each new discovery, the stakes grew higher. He couldn't help but feel the walls closing in around him. It was as though every turn he took led to a deeper rabbit hole, one that wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. But what he discovered next was far more than he had anticipated. As the investigation continued, he began receiving strange messages, cryptic, veiled threats that left him wondering whether his discovery was really worth the risk. Friends started distancing themselves, people he thought he could trust became uncomfortably silent. There were whispers, rumors that the more he uncovered, the more he put himself in the path of those who controlled the system. He had no way of knowing who was watching him, who had access to the information he was gathering, or how far this web of corruption reached. The truth, as he was beginning to learn, could cost him everything. But there was something else that changed him. Something deeper than just fear. It was a moment, a chilling realization that no one else was going to do what he was doing. No one else was going to risk their life for justice. In that moment, he made a choice. He would expose what he knew, no matter the cost. He knew that the truth had the power to bring down powerful people, but he also knew that it could destroy him in the process. Yet, despite the mounting pressure and the very real danger that loomed over him, he refused to back down. He knew what was at stake, he knew that the system was broken and that no one else would care enough to fix it. What followed was the beginning of a trail that led directly to the heart of the corruption itself, leading him closer to the people who held the strings of power. As the investigation deepened, the stakes grew higher, and so did the threats. What started as vague warnings turned into blatant attempts to intimidate him into silence. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. He began to fear not just for his career, but for his life. And that fear wasn't unfounded. The warnings came in many forms. Strange phone calls late at night, with voices disguised and messages cryptic. At first, it was the usual threats, a simple, "You don't know who you're dealing with." But the tone grew darker over time. His family received phone calls too, threats aimed directly at his loved ones. The more he revealed, the more the people behind the curtain made it clear they would stop at nothing to ensure his silence. In the months leading up to the events that would change everything, he became increasingly paranoid. His phone line was tapped, his computer hacked, his movements monitored. He was no longer just a man investigating corruption, he had become a target. And yet, despite the growing threats, he refused to back down. He couldn't. He knew too much. The system he had once trusted was no longer a place of justice, it was a machine that crushed anyone who dared to expose its flaws. In a desperate bid to protect himself, he took to the public stage. In one of his final videos, he laid it all out, his discoveries, the threats against him, and his growing fear that he was running out of time. "This is no longer just about me," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've uncovered something that goes to the very heart of the judicial system. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't natural. I need protection, and I need it now. If I go missing or turn up dead, you'll know who did it." In that video, he named names. He detailed the people who had made his life a living nightmare. It wasn't just the judges and lawyers, it was the corporate interests, the political players, and the ones who controlled it all. It was the very system itself that was fighting back. And in doing so, he gave a name to the evil he had uncovered, shining a light on the darkness that surrounded him. The video sent shockwaves through the public. His supporters rallied behind him, urging authorities to step in and offer protection. But behind the scenes, things were already in motion. Someone, somewhere, had already decided that his silence was more important than the truth. And then, on a quiet afternoon, it happened. The news came swiftly, he was dead. But the details were murky, the explanations inconsistent. The authorities were quick to call it an accident, but even those who had little stake in the case couldn't ignore the oddities. His body was found in an unremarkable location, seemingly in a place where he had no reason to be. No witnesses. No surveillance footage. No clear cause of death. The official story? A tragic accident. He had simply fallen while walking along a poorly lit street, perhaps due to an unfortunate stumble. But the official narrative didn't add up. Those who knew him, those who had supported him, didn't believe it. They believed he had been silenced. They believed someone had taken steps to make sure he wouldn't speak again. They pointed to the bruises that didn't seem to match the fall, to the unusual positioning of his body, to the fact that there were no footprints near his body, no trace of him having been in that spot before. Was it an accident, or something far more sinister? The questions were there, hanging in the air, unanswered. And the answers, if they existed, were buried deep in the systems he had been trying to expose. But his death raised a chilling question: what would happen to those who dared to speak out against a system that would go to any lengths to protect itself? After the death of the whistleblower, the official narrative was set in stone, a tragic accident, an unfortunate incident that didn't require further investigation. But the public wasn't buying it. His supporters rallied, demanding answers, questioning the official story, and raising the stakes for those who believed they could bury the truth. The authorities, seemingly unfazed by the outcry, stuck to their version of events. Investigators closed the case quickly, citing lack of evidence for foul play. They labeled the incident as a simple fall, a moment of clumsiness, an accident that occurred in the dead of night on an empty street. But for anyone who had followed his story, it didn't add up. There were too many unanswered questions, questions that the authorities seemed all too eager to leave behind. Why had the whistleblower's body been found in such an unlikely location, far from his usual places of work or residence? Why were there no clear signs of struggle, but plenty of signs of confusion? Why, despite all the odds, did his family and close friends remain adamant that something was wrong? They weren't just mourning, they were demanding justice. As more information began to trickle out, thanks to investigative journalists, whistleblower advocates, and the family members who refused to let this go, the inconsistencies in the investigation became even more glaring. The autopsy report was rushed and incomplete, with certain sections redacted, giving rise to even more questions. Why were certain toxicology tests ignored? Why was there no thorough analysis of the scene? And why was there no attention paid to the very real threats he had received before his death? The authorities refused to answer. The message was clear: he was dead, and that was the end of it. But the whistleblower's legacy didn't end with his death. The implications of his findings still loomed large, and the ramifications of his discoveries continued to reverberate throughout the judicial system, even after his voice had been silenced. His investigations had uncovered the very heart of the corruption, a network of bribery, fraud, and illegal activity that had existed for decades. The foreclosure cases he had been working on were just the tip of the iceberg. Behind those cases was a tangled web of powerful players, judges, lawyers, and corporate elites who had been skimming off the system for years. What made his discoveries so dangerous was that they weren't just isolated incidents. His findings indicated a deep-seated, systemic issue, a judicial system manipulated for profit, where the law was nothing more than a tool for the rich and powerful to bend to their will. This wasn't just about one case, it was about a widespread, organized effort to subvert justice for financial gain. But as those who had followed his work soon realized, the threat to the system wasn't just about the revelations, it was about what would happen if the public truly understood the scope of this corruption. The people behind the scenes, the ones pulling the strings, didn't care about one man's life. They cared about protecting the system they had built. And if one man had to die to protect it, then so be it. The deeper one looked, the more it became apparent this wasn't an isolated death, but part of a broader strategy to protect the very fabric of a corrupted system. The courts, the judges, the lawyers, all of them had a hand in the system that was crumbling around them. They had blood on their hands, and they were willing to go to any lengths to stop anyone who might bring it to light. And so, after his death, the questions didn't stop. They multiplied. Why was the investigation closed so quickly? Why were so many details of his life and death ignored? Why would someone go to such lengths to silence this man? What did he know that was so dangerous that it could have brought down the entire judicial system? As we've walked through the investigation, the threats, and the tragic end of the whistleblower's story, it's time to answer the question that has lingered in your mind since the beginning: who is this man? What made him risk everything to challenge one of the most powerful systems in the world? This brave man was Sonny Shu, a regular homeowner, an ordinary individual, who found himself embroiled in a fight against corruption so entrenched that it reached the very heart of the judicial system. A man whose search for justice led him to uncover systemic corruption that had been buried for years, a corruption so dangerous that it ultimately cost him his life. Before he became a whistleblower, Sonny Shu was, by all accounts, an average man, a husband, a father, and a homeowner in New York City. But his life was about to be irreversibly changed. When he began digging into the practices of banks, courts, and law firms involved in foreclosure cases, he stumbled upon something he couldn't ignore. The system that was supposed to protect homeowners like him was deeply flawed, bent by greed, manipulation, and deceit. He wasn't just uncovering a few isolated cases of wrongdoing. What he found was a vast network of corruption, involving fraudulent foreclosure processes, fraudulent property transfers, and even the manipulation of court rulings. As Sonny dug deeper into the paperwork, the case files, and the court documents, he uncovered undeniable evidence of illegal practices, document falsification, foreclosures that were mishandled, and blatant disregard for the rights of homeowners. But what was most damning was the undeniable trail of connections between these criminal acts and powerful figures in the judicial system: judges, lawyers, and high-ranking members of financial institutions. These were not just isolated incidents, they were systematic efforts to exploit the vulnerable, to profit off the backs of everyday citizens. Sonny's documents were meticulously organized, his notes were clear, and his understanding of the corruption he had uncovered was profound. His findings threatened to expose an entire network of individuals who had manipulated the legal system for their own gain, using their positions of power to not only profit financially, but also to protect each other from any legal ramifications. But as he got closer to the truth, the stakes grew higher. The threats against him escalated. Despite his warning that he feared for his life, he kept pushing forward, knowing that he couldn't turn back. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the people he had discovered were being hurt by this system, people who had no voice, no power, and no way to fight back. But the price of truth, as we know all too well, is steep. Sonny Shu paid that price. In the wake of his death, the investigation was quickly closed and the authorities moved on, writing his death off as an accident. But to anyone who knew the full story, it was far more than that. Sonny Shu had uncovered the rot at the core of a broken system, and someone didn't want that truth to see the light of day. The documents he left behind, the notes he made, the trail he was following, they were more than just evidence. They were a roadmap of systemic corruption that could have brought down powerful individuals in the judicial and financial systems. And though the authorities might have closed the case, the story didn't end there. The fight for justice that Sonny Shu had started would live on even after his death. Sonny Shu is more than just a man who uncovered corruption, he is a symbol of what can happen when one individual dares to stand against an unjust system. His story is a reminder that sometimes the price of truth is not just personal, it can cost you everything. But it also serves as a rallying cry for those who are willing to continue the fight. Today, we are left with questions that remain unanswered. How many more people like Sonny Shu are out there, fighting battles they'll never win? How many more individuals have uncovered similar corruption and never lived to tell the tale? And perhaps most importantly, what is the cost of silence? What happens when the truth is buried and the systems of power continue to operate without oversight? These are the questions we must ask ourselves as we reflect on the life and death of Sonny Shu, a man who dared to challenge the very system that had been built to protect those who held power. As we come to the end of this story, Sonny Shu's life and legacy leave us with more questions than answers. His bravery, his relentless pursuit of justice, and his ultimate sacrifice are a sobering reminder of the cost of exposing the truth. What would drive a man to risk everything, his safety, his home, even his life, for a cause? And what does it say about the systems we trust when the truth they bury is paid for in blood? Sonny Shu's story isn't just his own. It's the story of countless individuals who dared to stand up against the powerful, the corrupt, and the untouchable. It's a story of courage, of resilience, and of a tragic end that demands accountability. But it's also a story of hope, a hope that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth will eventually prevail. What do you think really happened to Sonny Shu? Was his death a tragic accident, as some would have us believe? Or was it a deliberate attempt to silence a man who knew too much? We want to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation alive because silence is complicity and the fight for justice starts with speaking up. If stories like Sonny's matter to you, if they inspire you, if they make you question the systems around us, then join us. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. Together, we can shine a light on the stories that others want to keep in the dark.